Okay, okay, red means record. So we're gonna start with the affirmative first speaker. Get 5 minutes. Yep. Whenever you're ready.
Sorry, what's your name?
I'm Ashley.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
The motion for us today is that the death penalty should be abolished. We stand in the affirmative. Before we continue, I will inform everyone of the terms we should understand in this debate, which are abolishing and death penalty. According to Oxford Languages, to abolish is to formally put an end to system, practice, or institution. The death penalty is a punishment of execution administered to someone legally convicted of a capital crime. Capital crimes in the U.S. can include murder, genocide, terrorism, and kidnapping of a congressman, Supreme Court justice, or president. In the U.S., a jury is able to decide whether to impose a death penalty. The power is all in their hands, but should we trust them with so much authority over the defendant's life? Today, the death penalty is not given to small offenses, but the chances of it being given to innocent lives or wrongfully used is an issue we face in our country today. We will be speaking on the motion today through a United States lens. And as the affirmative, we have a couple needs for change. The death penalty should be abolished because it is discriminatory and unjust, as it is an irreversible punishment that could execute innocent people. If it is established to punish someone for their unlawful actions, how are we 100% sure we are rightfully sentencing someone for a crime they have truly committed? Abolishing can allow us to be just with the wrongfully and unfairly committed and do away with ending someone's life overall. Is the death penalty fair for all individuals? The death penalty continues to be more commonly given to Black defendants and other people of color. According to the American Progress, Black and Hispanic people represent 31% of the U.S. population, but make up 53% of death row inmates. It is discriminatory to people of color. The color of our skin should not determine our sentence, but it should be fair for all kinds of people. It should solely be based on the crime committed and should be equal for all. These kind of cases could fall into the wrong hands and be in jeopardy all because of a biased jury, racial disparities, and racial profiling. It is no secret that the color of a victim's skin plays a huge role in what the final verdict will be. The American Civil Liberties Union states, as of October 2002, 12 people have been executed where the defendant was white and the murder victim was Black, compared to the 178 Black defendants executed for murderers with white victims. White defendants do not get the same punishment as Black defendants do. The death penalty is a result of an unjust system. The death penalty is a very expensive punishment, and we can surely use this money elsewhere. In the article by Human Rights Careers, the median cost of a non-death penalty case is $700,000, while the median cost of a death penalty case through execution is a striking $1.26 billion. These funds could be used in different ways, such as education. Human Resource Career states that according to the International Federation of Human Rights, 95% of prisoners on death row in the United States come from underprivileged backgrounds. The people that are at higher risk of facing death row come from poverty or have less education. If we were to put these funds into the schooling system, we could stop this cycle. We are human. It is understandable that we all make mistakes, but taking someone's life for a crime they did not commit is not a mistake we can allow to happen. You can always have a retrial, but it is impossible to bring someone back to life. Amnesty International explains how execution is the ultimate irreversible punishment. The risk of executing an innocent person can never be eliminated. Since 1973, for example, more than 191 prisoners sentenced to death row in the U.S. have been later incarcerated or released from death row on grounds of innocence. Others have been executed despite serious doubts about their guilt. Imagine if those who were not found innocent have already been executed. One might believe that executing a person for a life lost is justice, but it is only an act of anger. It is revenge. If the action is done to the wrong individual, where do we go from there? These are risks we are not allowed to take. There are small factors that could lead to pushing a trial in the wrong way, such as false accusations and errors in forensic science and technology. If the wrong person is executed, it could also leave the victim and defendant's family having doubts within our justice system. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, since 1973, at least 195 people who have been wrongfully, 103 of these people were Black people. Imagine the people who were not released. That is way too many lives in jeopardy due to mistakes from a system that could have been prevented. The system failed them. As a punishment is irreversible, when errors are brought to light, how can we trust our government? On the Human Rights Careers website, they stated that in 2000, Professor James Libman from Columbia Law released a study examining every capital conviction and appeal from 1973 to 1995. More than 90% of the states that gave death sentences had overall error rates of 52 or higher. 85% of states had error rates of 60 or higher. A more recent analysis from 2014 collected data from all death sentences. They estimated that around 1 in 25 of those given the death sentence.
All right. Thank you.
I just noticed your names too, so I guess you don't have to
Okay.
introduce yourselves.
Okay.
All right, and then we'll be going to the negative. First speaker, 5 minutes. Are you ready?
6 out of 10 American adults strongly or somewhat favor the death penalty for convicted murderers, according to a research conducted by the Pew Research Center in April 2021. Likewise, 64% of respondents also argued that the death penalty is morally justified when the defendant is charged with crimes such as murder. Today, we will argue against the resolution that the death penalty should be abolished, and we will present that by discussing retribution and why it matters. According to the Oxford Dictionary, retribution is directly defined as punishment inflicted on someone as vengeance for a wrong or criminal act. Retribution is the notion that punishment is imposed because it is deserved. The reality is that only certain cases can even qualify for the death penalty to be applied. We're not talking about average offenders. We're talking about people who have committed heinous crimes, as we will show you today. The opposing side will want you to feel empathy for those offenders, people who have murdered others in cold blood. We're talking about people who took away people's loved ones. Aren't they owed something? What are their lives worth? In 1997, 10-year-old Anthony Martinez was kidnapped just 20 feet away from his house. Unfortunately, the investigation was not prosperous, and his body was found 10 days later in the desert. His family went years without closure, and police went through about 15,000 leads trying to find who was responsible for Anthony's murder. Suddenly, in 2005, an 8-year-old girl, Shasta Grown, and 9-year-old Dylan Grown were kidnapped. According to court records, they were taken to Lolo National Forest in Montana when they were tortured and Dylan was murdered. Shasta survived after she was spotted with their perpetrator at a local diner. Their mother, their mother's partner, and their 13-year-old brother were also killed by the kidnapper. Joseph Edward Duncan was the man responsible for all these horrible acts. In 2006, he pled guilty to the murders of the Grown family. However, it wasn't until he was already in custody and convicted that he confessed to numerous other murders, mainly of other children. Among those were Anthony Martinez and 2 sisters from Washington who were 11 and 9 years old. Duncan even waived his right to appeal in 2008, and the judge had deemed him competent, meaning that this man had taken away innocent lives without showing any remorse. The judge who was hearing the case and imposed the death penalty said, "This crime was horrendous, and its impact on the families, the community, the jurors, court staff, our litigation team, and law enforcement were far-reaching. While his death will not bring back the lives cut so tragically short or remove the indelible memories of his unspeakable acts, perhaps death will now allow space for some degree of healing, peace, and closure." While on death row, Duncan had been diagnosed with brain cancer, which led to his passing in 2021. After this, Anthony's father said, "What I would have liked to witness his execution, knowing that he is now standing before God, being held accountable for what he has done, what he did to my son, and the horrible crimes he committed to others, that's the real justice." Anthony's mother also shared, "The sun is brighter today, and my soul is lighter. The world is a more beautiful place without the evil that is Joseph Duncan. God chose to make his end a long-suffering, and I believe that is fitting. The horror of his thoughts consumed him." Capital punishment can bring peace to the families of those affected. In 2018, many of us saw the horrific tragedy that happened in Parkland, Florida. As far as mass shootings go, this was the deadliest to reach a jury trial in the United States. A life sentence for the gunman was recommended by the jury in 2022, which distraught the victims' families. A quote given by a victim's family member to BBC News says, "We're just shocked by this result, and it is so unjust. How can he live another day?" A teacher who testified in the case said, "It means most of the parents will not outlive this shooter. I've lost all my faith in the justice system after this." This is what the abolishment of the death penalty means for victims' families. They have to live with the memory of their loved ones being taken away and watch as the person responsible gets to spend their life in prison.
Okay. Got it? Alrighty? Okay.
Crossfire now?
Yep, crossfire between the two speakers, each get 2 minutes. Whoever wants to start first.
I have a question. The crossfire,
Oh,
Oh.
about crossfire.
Yes.
Let me,
so the crossfire, from what we were told, is against each other, right?
You're,
Yeah.
you're both asking each other
So we
questions.
each get 2 minutes, or is it 2 minutes
It's
together?
2 minutes total.
Okay, that's
And,
fine.
like,
Okay.
technically, I think the norm is like you kind of trade off questions, basically.
Okay,
is
that's, okay.
the sort of polite thing that people agree on.
Okay.
You don't have to if you don't want to.
yeah. But whenever you guys are ready, yeah.
Alrighty. How are we so sure that the people feel relieved that they took a life for a life?
Well, there is testimony by the victims' families, and they usually do feel some type of relief that the person that caused their family so much harm is now not part of this world, I guess.
But what if they got the wrong person? Would they still feel relieved?
Well, nowadays, there is not that much of a big risk of taking convicting the wrong person of a crime. We have a lot of technology now, and there's a very lengthy process, as one of the reasons why death row is usually many, many years. You also said that the death penalty costs about $1.26 billion. Do you have a source that backs that up, or what is the, like, where exactly does that information come from? Is there a specific state, or is that a general?
It was in an article by Human Rights Careers. They stated that the death penalty case to execution is a strike at 1.26 billion. It's a median cost.
Okay. Because we do have a study that's done here in Texas that said it was backed by the Dallas Morning News, that said that on average, capital punishment cases can cost around 2.3 million, which there is a big gap between there. So.
I mean, we don't feel empathy for those who are murdered in cold blood, but it is simply about the principle. How as we as humans, able to decide if we can take a life or not?
Well, that applies the other way around as well. What made them better than others to take the lives of others as well?
It's not, the death penalty isn't as for justice, it's more as for revenge. And we shouldn't give the government the opportunity to have that in their hands, because from our evidence, it's been wrongfully used.
Time's up.
Is that-
Key? Okay,
The second affirmative speaker?
that's right. Second affirmative speaker? Yes. Yeah, 5 minutes, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, the opposing team, our judge, and then our audience. Today, as the second speaker, I would like to enhance my team's statement that overall, the death penalty is unjust, unfair, and heavily discriminatory. Years of innocent lives have been stolen by the government, and this has proven that and we need to prove that there is no price to human rights and human life, and the government should never have the right to decide whether someone lives or dies, especially when it is heavily surrounded by, for years of discriminatory based factors. Our other team today stated many points approving the cruel death penalty. However, I'm here to state the reasons against those statements. One of the big things they all said was that 7 out of 10 families prefer the death penalty as a use for execution. However, many families, according to the Death Penalty Info Center, many families' victims actually renounce the use of the death penalty because two wrongs do not make a right, and yet one person died, we do not need to bring more people into the factor. There is no reason that more people need to die. It is not an eye for an eye or a life for a life. Another thing that y'all stated was that school shooters and just shooters in general, this is not a life for life situation. This is a breach of the 8th Amendment, which states no cruel and unusual punishments, and is very rarely a life for life. For instance, in 1873, William Jackson purchased some horses from his friend in Beatrice, Nebraska. Soon after, the friend he got the horses from went missing. It was just kind of simply put like, oh, he must have killed his friend, and he was sentenced to death soon after. However, it was proven soon later that the friend had just ran away from a girl that he got pregnant. So it is so loose in how they decide this, and it's so expensive in sentencing the death penalty. It's proven that they are so loose in accuracy that the death penalty might as well be used for population control. According to the UG USA page, it is discussed that a single death sentence case costs almost $2 million because you have to make sure that there's enough witnesses, lawyers, experts, and all the extra trials to ensure it's the right chance, all for those people to go away emotionally unstable because they just sentenced someone to death. The emotional welfare of our citizens is just as important. The main argument that we have presented in favor is, simply put, is unjust and irreversible. There is no reason that we need to be to have the power to sentence other people to death. That should never be a decision that one has. And that's all I have.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Then, let's see. The negative second speaker. Whenever you're ready, 5 minutes.
You mentioned a lot of innocence. Well, it goes without saying that endorsing the death penalty raises ethical concerns. Can two wrongs result in a right? Is it appropriate to respond to these acts with the phrase an eye for an eye? If we have the power to choose someone else's fate, what does it say about our own legal system? But if we hadn't gone far enough, what would it suggest? Although these concerns are legitimate and relevant to the discussion at hand, our attention should be directed at the initial case of these inmates' opposition to the penalty. These are not your typical criminals. Ted Bundy, who murdered and raped at least 30 women, Randy Kraft, who raped, tortured, and killed at least 16 young men, Kenneth McDuff, who tortured and strangled nearly 11 people, are the types of criminals we are discussing. These aren't your typical perpetrators. These are individuals who saw murdering as if killing another human was a kind of recreation for them. These individuals deserve to be punished. I'd like to draw attention to some criminals who deserve the death penalty but were not faced with the death penalty. You would expect someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed and dismembered 17 men, Nicholas Cruz, who opened fire on students, killing 17 in a high school, or Gary Ridgway, who is assumed to have killed over 90 people to be executed, but none of them were even placed on death row. Therefore, you have to realize a death penalty is necessary when being found guilty of such crimes. Jeffrey Dahmer beat, dismembered, tortured his numerous victims, but one man was able to slip away. Tracy Edwards was able to testify against Dahmer in court, resulting in Dahmer's 15 consecutive life sentences. According to History.com, Dahmer did not face the death penalty at all and was beaten to death by another inmate. Dahmer did unspeakable things to his victims and left so many people troubled and disturbed for the rest of their lives. People magazine reported that 20 years after escaping Dahmer, Tracy Edwards had also turned to crime. He attempted to throw another man over a bridge, but was unsuccessful. According to ABC News, Edwards' defense attorney, Paul Kaczynski, claims that Edwards is so disturbed by what happened with Dahmer that it drove him crazy. Kaczynski even relates Edwards to Humpty Dumpty because he was never able to put pieces back together again. Imagine how different things could have been for Edwards if justice was served. The fact that Dahmer was killed in prison is a far more grotesque and disturbing way to be punished, and according to ABC News, his defense attorney relates Edwards' problems back to how the justice system failed Edwards, leading him to go mad. Kenneth McDuff, alongside with Roy Dale Green, kidnapped Robert Brand and Marcus Dunham and shot them both in the head, and also tied up, repeatedly raped, and strangled Edna Louise with a broomstick so violently it broke her neck. Unimaginably painful things were done to Edna. Roy Dale Green felt so guilty for his actions that he ended up turning himself in, resulting in McDuff's first death sentence. Notice how I said first. Kenneth McDuff is the only man in Texas history to have ever been sentenced to death for murder, let out of prison for overcrowding, murdered more people, and resent to death row. The man who shot, beat, and raped his at least 9 confirmed victims was let out of prison carelessly, only for him to commit many more murders. So many more innocent lives were taken as a result of the suspension of the death penalty. Justice should have been served the first time. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 88% of federal inmate deaths are caused by natural causes. One may wonder why there would be a conviction in the first place. The intention is to exact retribution on the families of the victims, because these criminals have justified their own actions as the judge, jury, and executioner. It is crucial that we be able to deliver justice to innocent people who will carry the burden of loss for the rest of their lives. These cruel criminals have shown no mercy. These people up against the death penalty have shown the worst vices that our civilization has ever encountered. Serial killers, mass murderers, and school shooters are the kinds of individuals who deserve to be executed. It is only human to raise concern with the morality of the death penalty, but let your humanity also recognize the grief, the loss, the void left by these criminals' actions for these parents, siblings, and significant others. Since they haven't shown any mercy to their victims, why should we?
Got it. Thank you. Alrighty. The crossfire between the secondary speakers, you guys get 2 minutes whenever you're ready.
So what year was the William Jackson incident that you mentioned?
That was 1973.
1973?
Yes.
I have a source here that says that it was in 1872. And do you think that a source from 1872 is a valid source to support your argument?
The death penalty was introduced in the 1700s. So wouldn't that also count as outdated?
Well, the death penalty is like constantly changing and still relevant, like right now.
I'd like to mention, you started your statement by saying that 2 wrongs don't make a right, so shouldn't you agree that killing someone for killing is 2 wrongs?
No, because the people that we're talking about are people who killed like numerous people, so they didn't just take, it's not necessarily an eye for an eye, it's more like they took so much and
For instance, one of the people that you mentioned was Jeffrey Dahmer. That was another white man that had done horrendous, horrendous crimes that never got put on death row.
we allow law enforcement to decide whether or not the use of legal force in the field is justified. Why can we not also apply this to capital punishment? If you feel in your home that you are under attack or duress, Texas law allows you to stand your ground to protect yourself, granting the use of lethal force. Why would a lengthy judicial process not be seen in the same light to protect our society against the most dangerous of offenders, people who kill presidents, mass murderers, terrorists, etc.?
Is that not just as dangerous as the government being allowed to racially have a bias and kill whoever they want?
I don't think that goes with the question I just asked. I don't think that's relevant.
So why have the conviction in the first
A time.
place?
Okay. Affirmative, third speaker. 5 minutes. Whenever you guys are ready.
The main argument we have presented in favor of abolishing the death penalty is based on the assertion that it is unjust and an irreversible punishment. Our debate focused on 2 fundamental ideas, discrimination and bias, and the irreversible risk of a wrongful execution. It also raises an important question. that everyone should ponder. How can we as human beings assume the power to be able to take someone's life regardless of the crime committed? And also, how is the main argument of the death penalty, a life for a life, truly beneficial to those who seek closure and retribution? Our primary point of discrimination and bias, as previously stated, affects how the death penalty is often applied, which is often unfair to people of color. Statistics show that Black and Hispanic individuals make up a disproportionately high percentage of death row inmates, raising concerns about racial bias. Discrimination based on the skin color of the victim has also been shown in the United States' long-standing history with the death penalty, in which someone who has murdered a person of color is less likely to receive the death penalty than a person who has murdered a white individual. According to Equal Justice USA, nationally almost half, 47%, of all murder victims since the 1970s are Black. But for cases ending in execution, only 17% of the murder victims are Black, which is from a 2023 article, Racial Inequity and the Death Penalty. This argument emphasizes that the color of a person's skin should not determine their sentence, neither should the color of the victim's skin determine if the inmate should receive the death penalty in the first place. It should be solely based on the crime committed, ensuring equal treatment for all individuals. Our secondary point underscores the irreversible nature of the death penalty. It argues that human beings are not fallible and that taking someone's life for a crime they did not commit is a mistake that cannot be rectified. According to the Innocence Project, a 2014 study estimated that at least 4% of those sentenced to death are innocent. Also, according to the DAP, since 1973, there have been at least 190 people who have been exonerated from death row. The risk of executing innocent people is highlighted with the total amount of exonerations of individuals on death row. Even if there's a small percentage or small chance that we could be killing someone innocent, then that means the system as a whole is flawed. It shouldn't be put in the first place if we have the risk of killing someone who didn't commit the crime that they thought they were going to commit, or commit the crime that they have on their shoulders, even though they didn't commit it. Furthermore, it is beneficial to also consider the families of the victims when we discuss the death penalty. Would these families truly feel like justice has been served solely based on the fact that the person who took away the person they love dearly has been killed? Does death itself equal closure? We should also consider how our justice and legal system works. Most capital cases that involve murder take years to be tried in court on account of building a solid case against the accused. So according to the law offices of R. Shane Seaton, PLLC, the length of time before a case goes to trial depends on how quickly the arresting officer is able to prepare his offense report, or if the case will require additional investigation. This was from the article, What is the General Timeline of a Criminal Case in Texas, 2019. For example, Dylan Roof, the perpetrator of the Charleston shooting in June 17, 2015, which killed 9 African Americans, went on to trial on December 8, 2016, and was convicted on December 28, 16, which is a year in between, and he has still not been put to death. So these families that often wait for the day that the perpetrator who took their loved one away will be executed, hoping that they will find some form of solace in the fact that this person can never harm anyone again, it brings up old trauma that they have to deal for years and years and years. So according to separate testimonies from different relatives of victims collected by the PBS NewsHour, even when the executions take place, the surviving family's pain doesn't disappear with the perpetrator's pulse. So in conclusion, the death penalty should be abolished in the United States due to discrimination and bias that affects the system in the first place, moral and ethical concerns about its application, and its limited ability to provide closure to victims' families. While we desire for justice in the face of heinous crimes is natural, the risks of executing innocent individuals argue for its elimination from the American justice system. And that's my time.
Thank you. All right. We go to the negative. Third speaker, 5 minutes. Whenever you're ready.
You mentioned how the death penalty carries the inherent risk of executing an innocent person, but only 2% are actually innocent. Innocent lives taken have nothing to do with the death penalty. It has to do with our justice system. failing us, and that's a separate issue. However, capital punishment is often defended on the grounds that society has a moral obligation to protect the safety and welfare of its citizens and communities. Murderers threaten this safety and welfare only by putting murderers to death can society ensure that convicted killers do not kill again, whether that be on the streets or in prisons when they are sentenced to life. For example, Robert Hansen, he was a recreational killer. He would abduct and rape his murder victims and hunt for them, oftentimes releasing his victims back into society with threats that they had to keep it secret, and that many of them feared for their lives, and then they later died anyways. He was only sentenced to 461 years without the possibility of parole after killing 17 women. Throughout the 70s and early 80s, Hansen targeted sex workers and exotic dancers, abducting these women to turn them loose into the woods so that he can hunt them recreationally like animals. This is a terrifying true story of the Butcher Baker killer, who was also deemed as a serial killer. In 1972, he was arrested twice, once for the abduction and attempted rape of a housewife, and again for raping a prostitute, but was never given any actual punishment. And then obviously that led him to killing 17 women, even though they caught him many times before, and he was released back into the streets. His killing spree began in 1973, likely emboldened by his ability to walk free after his early crimes, and pretty much getting a slap on the wrist every time he was caught. In the year of 1976, Hansen was arrested again and sentenced to 5 years for shoplifting a chainsaw. However, he appealed that sentence and was released again back into society, while he continued to prey on strippers and sex workers who he forced to act as his twisted fantasy for recreation. In 1983, more than a decade after Hansen moved to Anchorage, a 17-year-old girl named Cindy Paulson was found running frantically down 6th Avenue, barefoot and handcuffed by him. After being picked up by a driver and returned to safety, Paulson, a prostitute, told her story to police. She described being held hostage by a man who handcuffed her to his car, held her down by gunpoint, and took her to his house, where he chained her by the neck. The man raped and tortured and repeatedly before attempting to load her onto a plane and take her to his cabin in Matanuska-Susitna Valley, which was 35 miles north of Anchorage. As the man prepared the plane for takeoff, Paulson managed to escape, leaving her shoes behind as evidence. Robert Hansen fits the description of not only a kidnapper perfectly, but a serial killer. But police were still reluctant to bring him in. After all, though he was no longer a stranger to trouble with the law, the local baker was well known and liked in the community. Hansen admitted that he met the girl, but claimed he was that she was setting him up because he refused to play her, sex games, which that was not true. What he told police was he had a strong alibi provided by a friend. He was released, but no one knew the truth after more than a decade. The hunter had also been collecting trophies of these women, so after he'd kill them, he'd keep a piece of their hair or a piece that would remind them of him, or vice versa. He'd keep something of them to remember the moment, because he loved to kill. Not only animals, but he loved to kill people, and to him it was a sport. He is now in prison for 461 years without possibility of parole, which makes no sense because you did talk about the cost. It actually costs more to keep somebody in prison than it does to give them the death penalty. And we want to talk about innocent lives. Well, what about the innocent lives of these women who were killed in cold blood with their families having really no rest to the case because the killer is still in jail living his life like nothing really happened, and he brags about it as if it was a sport.
All right.
Crossfire now?
Yep, Grand Crossfire. 3 minutes.
So first I'd like to bring up the fact that when you first started your introduction, you mentioned that $1.26 billion was how much the death penalty actually cost on average. That was obviously false because according to pretty much any Google search, Bruin Political Review, Arkansas State Legislature, the Office of Justice Program, the Death Penalty Information Center, it's obviously seen that it only costs $1.26 million, and while that is 3 times more expensive than keeping somebody in jail, I'm curious what other statements that may have been from false claims. I'd also like to bring up the fact that you guys mentioned 192 people have been exonerated since, but you failed to mention that that was out of over 8,500 people. Some of these statistics were found from the Innocence Project, and they were also found from the American Civil Liberties Union, sources that only support the abolition of the death penalty. But if you actually cared to look beyond the number of 192, then you would have seen that it was over 8,500 people. You also mentioned that there was a lot of racial disparities that happened because of the death penalty, and you're absolutely right, but you're failing to acknowledge that most of these cases that you're looking at that have been exonerated were upheld when segregation was still a thing. We've seen these cases being exonerated since 1973. That's exactly where your source came from, because we use the exact same one. But you need to understand that these exonerations are happening because we're seeing the false pretenses that people were put under the death penalty in our society today, and we're correcting those things. So if you want to mention that the death...
I'm sorry, this is a questioning period, is it not?
This is the
Grand Crossfire?
This is the crossfire.
This is the.
I'm just, what's the question that you're
I'm
asking?
trying to see a question there as well.
The question is that would you like to give us some type of
Well, before you come up with a question, I have a question of my own, actually. You mentioned that the issue is not the death penalty itself, but the system. How can we keep the death penalty if we still operate under the flawed system? So I'm just curious what ideas you have to improve this system to where it wouldn't be flawed anymore. Because even if the death penalty itself is a good idea, putting it under such a flawed system with, flawed people of power can make this system dangerous as well.
And we have to agree on that, but the resolution right now is should it be abolished or not, and you guys actually did, bring up a lot of this arguments about whether the death penalty should be abolished, but you haven't really bring up any alternatives like you said. So how can we know that prisoners will not try to escape prison,
Right.
such as TJ Lane, who escaped prison and was convicted of killing 3 different students in a high school?
With the money that we use for the death penalty, we can put back into the prison systems and make it better. Ted Bundy actually escaped twice.
Time. Okay. It's gonna be,
The first final focus speech from the half.
yeah. Fourth speaker, you get 5 minutes, whenever you're ready.
Judge, today you should consider our stance in this motion because people are not only being discriminated against and wrongfully committed, but their lives are at stake. A quote by Brian Stevenson states that the reality is that capital punishment in America is a lottery. It is a punishment that is shaped by the constraints of poverty, race, geography, and local politics. The death penalty has been made more than just a consequence of a capital crime. It is used wrongfully against defendants of color. Yes, it could give a sense of justice to victims and their families, but again, what if they execute the wrong person? Where do you go from that? There is no way to correct this. We cannot bring someone back to life. Now, someone lost their life for something they did not commit, and everyone feels guilty for taking a life. The death penalty might be used to establish the law, but how can we assume it is given to everyone in all fairness? Where is the justice in these situations? The system is not only flawed, but it is failing the innocent. How can we trust the government to not make mistakes when they have all the power to take someone's life away? How do we trust them when they have shown us numerous times that these mistakes have been made and will continue to be made? Justice is not served by using the death penalty incorrectly, and they cannot continue to sweep their mistakes under the rug for much longer. The death penalty is not as fair and just to society as it was told to be. Abolishing the death penalty is a step we can take to provide equality for those who are discriminated against and for the wrongfully accused. We can fix our flawed justice system. And that's
All right, thank you. All right,
Can we use our prep time?
Sure.
Gilbert,
You know more about the format than me, so go ahead.
They said it was 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes of prep time. All right, go ahead. Just 2 minutes of
So
prep.
you have no more crossfires?
Yeah.
No more crossfires, yeah.
No, no, like crossfires.
Yeah. Okay, we're good.
All right. Whenever you guys are ready, 5 minutes. Or for fourth speaker, for the negative. Yeah, whenever you're ready.
As stated previously in our opening, retribution is defined in the Oxford Dictionary as punishment inflicted on someone as vengeance for a wrong or criminal act. Today, my team has argued against the resolution that the death penalty should be abolished, and we firmly believe that retribution is the justification for not abolishing the death penalty. I'm sure that at this point, something we can all agree on is that the debate over the death penalty is extremely complex. We've discussed some economic considerations from both sides, as well as contemplated different moral and ethical perspectives. And while the costs and expenses may raise valid concerns in some places, we mentioned some of the emotional meanings behind capital punishment as well, and why that is something that should be considered. Like Joseph Duncan, convicted serial killer and child molester, charged with murdering most members of the Green family, Brenda and Slade Green, as well as her husband, Mark McKenzie, later killing Dylan Green after kidnapping him. In prison, he was connected to murdering Anthony Martinez in Beaumont, California, as well as 2 young girls in Seattle, Washington, just 9 and 11 years old. The death penalty is the only thing that could be considered justice after leaving 8-year-old Shasta Green without her family, in addition to the countless monstrous acts he committed against all of his victims. Or like Ted Bundy, murdered and sexually assaulted over 30 victims across 7 different states, many after escaping prison twice, including 21-year-old Linda Healy, 19-year-old Donna Manson, 18-year-old Susan Rancourt, 21-year-old Margaret Bowman, 18-year-old Melanie Cooley, 17-year-old Laura Aim, as well as Kimberly Leach, or even Lynette Culver, who were only 12 years old, when Ted Bundy kidnapped, raped, and murdered them, along with countless other victims. The death of this one man only began the process of healing for the living victim that remained and all of the victims' families that were affected by his heinous acts of true evil. By now, it is clear to us that instead of outright abolition of the death penalty, there should be focus made on reforms to current policies, finding a balance between economic responsibility, moral integrity, and any of the other things we mentioned here today may lead to a more just and effective criminal justice system. However, that is not what we are here today to debate. We are here to debate whether or not the death penalty should be abolished, and to this question, the answer is no. The majority of the population, or approximately 64% of people, as presented by Pew Research Center as recently as April 2021, agree that not only should the death penalty not be abolished, but that it is also morally justified. Getting rid of the death penalty would be directly against a majority belief. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. And that is all.
No, there's 2 more speeches.
Oh, there's 2 more speeches?
Yeah, this.
No, it's one more.
No, I meant 1 from each side.
Oh, yeah.
There's 2 more. Yeah. This was what Brian was talking about before. 'Cause
You guys are
there's-
like,
Oh,
There's
okay.
another. It's just the same. The final focus. There's just 2 more final.
Okay, cool. Sorry. She had like 251.
Hmm?
She had,
No, that's fine.
yeah, let me just, music's in my ears right here. Good. It's my bad. Never done this before. Or, time continued.
No, you were done. Right?
Oh, yeah, I said,
Yeah.
I said I was done.
Yeah, she was done.
Yeah. So now it's the second final focus from the app.
Okay, cool.
Our final focus comes back down to how can we as people.
Oh, okay.
Do I just start over?
You can start over if you want.
Okay. Our final focus comes down to analyzing how can we as people have the moral high ground or decide what the moral high ground is when humans themselves are inherently selfish and driven by their own moral biases and their own needs for revenge. And how can we trust that the people that we choose to put in power will honor a neutral moral bias to make sure that those who, even if they are put on death row, deserve it in the first place. I mean, as you guys said before, Dahmer, Royal Day Green, Gary Ridgway, they all committed horrendous, horrific acts. However, none of them were sentenced to death row, and the one big common factor I can see here is not only are they white, they've all committed mass murder to some degree. However, our system is flawed to a point where we didn't put them on death row. So that, to me, doesn't make any sense. And the fact that we even have a racial bias to begin with is, well, highlights our incredibly flawed system. So, the death penalty itself is also an outdated form of punishment. It was created in the 1700s. So why put it to use today? It's, the 21st century. Can there not be different ways of punishment that would still bring retribution to families and still prevent these type of things from happening again? And the money that we do use to put people to death, can we not just use it to put it back into prisons? To either make them, more high security, or to change the way the prison system itself works to be more of teaching them to be rehabilitated instead of solely punished, so that they learn to not do it again instead of punishing them, and then when, say, they escape, they end up doing it all over again. But if you were concerned with punishment, then I say the ultimate punishment would be life in prison, not giving them the out of death, which is also another way that serial killers get out of paying for what they've done. They kill themselves, such as right when they're caught, such as the Columbine shooters. And overall, we as people cannot have that kind of power to decide whether someone lives or dies. 2 wrongs don't make a right. Just because this serial killer killed however many people, which I'm not agreeing with, that should be punished. But how will death serve as a punishment? How will that set a precedent for other offenders? And again, our justice system is incredibly broken, and if anything, such a strong punishment should not be determined over, when other people have certain biases, such as it could be race or age or gender, depending. So that's my time. And people also can't learn if they're dead. That's what I'm gonna finish up with.
Is that it? Or?
There's another 5-minute speech from the start.
Cool.
We've talked about a lot of reasons
Wait, one
why or
moment.
not the death penalty
Sorry,
should
one,
be
one, 1 second. I have to reset
You gotta
the.
get the timer ready.
Yeah. All right.
Hold on, I gotta restart mine. Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
All right, we've talked about a lot of reasons why or why not the death penalty should be abolished, but what it really boils down to is what we're gonna allow in our society. What standards are we gonna hold our people, the people of our nation to, and what kind of things are we gonna let people get away with? We talked about how there's obviously a moral question that comes into play when expressing support for the capital punishment. Do two wrongs make a right? Is an eye for an eye the proper response to these crimes? What would it say about our own justice system if we decided the fate of another? But what would it say if we hadn't done enough? What would it say if we let these people like Nicholas Cruz, Joseph Duncan, Jeffrey Dahmer, or Kenneth McDuff continuously get away with crimes deemed so disgustingly inhumane, not only by our society, but also by our justice system? What would you as a person need for these kind of offenders to do in order for you to feel the remorse or the anger or the injustice that we feel as a team happens when offenders like these kind of people don't see the true consequences of their actions? I want to emphasize the time and consideration it takes to deem a person responsible in receiving the death penalty. Like my team said, these are not your average offenders. Lily mentioned earlier that you would expect someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed and dismembered 17 men, Nicholas Cruz, who opened fire on students, killing 17 in a high school, or Gary Ridgway, who is assumed to have killed over 90 people, to be executed. But because fault was found in their mental stability, they never even saw death row. But this is because these judicial proceedings are so extensive and take into account every shadow of doubt before delivering the most absolute punishment. Isn't that what you want? The cost, $1.26 million, is so expensive to make because these judicial proceedings are as fair and as just as possible. We also already mentioned that in the last 50 years, an average of around 8,500 people were placed on death row out of the 2 million people incarcerated in the U.S. prison system today, which averages about 0.004 of all convictions that resulted in capital punishment. Being that they received this sentence, only 1,579 out of that 8,500 people have actually been executed since. That averages about 18% of all death row convicts and about 0.0007 of all incarcerated inmates. And out of the millions of trials every year, only 192 in the last 50 years were found to be wrongfully convicted from death row. Most of these, 52%, being black men convicted in a racially discriminatory trial, with both the judge and jury being against the own color of their skin. You can't ignore the fact that this is a prevalent subject when it comes to recent exonerations done since the 70s, but times have changed. Trials are no longer racially motivated, and everyone is allotted due process under the Constitution of the United States. This is why so many people are exonerated now. Our courts are realizing the inconsistencies in trials back then and correcting them. While 192 people have been exonerated in the last 50 years, racial disparity has definitely had a dramatic influence on them being wrongfully convicted in the first place. While our justice system in the United States tries their best to deliver fair justice to the public, unfortunately, mistakes are made. Rarely, the wrong people do get convicted and the right people walk free. It's a broken system, but most of the time it is a working system and a useful system. But if you beg to question the broken sense of the death penalty, also recognize the broken system that is our prison system, built off the back of slavery to monetize on criminal legislation. So take this into consideration when understanding that these convictions are not taken lightly and definitely not done out of ill will. Our judicial system finds it necessary to keep capital punishment for a reason, and I hope you will all find the understanding in all of our information we've provided you today. That's my time.
All right. Thank you. Got it?
Good job, y'all.
Just turn it off now.